Some places are abandoned for a reason. This story begins when a man returns to a small American town and finds something that should have stayed hidden. Like the video and subscribe before we begin. Henry Brooks had not planned on ever coming back to Cypress Bend. For most of his life, the small Louisiana town existed only as a memory he kept at a distance, like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer he never opened. He had left at 18, the week after his grandfather was buried, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and the quiet certainty that staying would suffocate him. Cypress Bend had been a place where everyone knew your name, your family, and, more importantly, where you stood. Henry had learned early that some families were meant to own land, while others were only meant to work it. 40 years later, it was a thin envelope with an official seal that pulled him back. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, mixed in with utility bills and advertisements. It was from the county records office, written in stiff, impersonal language. According to the notice, a property registered under the name Elijah Brooks, Henry's grandfather, had been classified as unclaimed for decades and was scheduled for public auction. The starting price was listed at $1. The address was instantly familiar. A narrow lot on the edge of town, a wooden house with a red front porch. Henry read the letter twice, then a third time, as if it might change. The house was supposed to be gone. Sold off, taken by the bank, or torn down long ago. That was what people had told him when he left. Yet here it was, resurfacing like something that refused to stay buried. He did not tell anyone about the letter. He booked a ticket, packed a small suitcase, and pointed his rented car south. The drive into Cypress Bend felt longer than it should have. The highway narrowed into a 2-lane road lined with cypress trees and low marshland. The air grew heavier, thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. When the town finally appeared, it looked smaller than Henry remembered. Fewer shops, more boarded windows. The old gas station was closed, its pumps rusted and leaning like tired men. Time had not been kind to the place, but it had not erased it either. The auction itself was brief and oddly quiet. It was held on the courthouse steps, a faded brick building with peeling white columns. Only a handful of people stood in attendance, most of them older, their faces weathered by sun and years. Henry recognized no one, but he felt their eyes on him the moment he stepped forward. When the auctioneer announced the property and opened the bidding, no hands went up. Not one. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Henry placed his bid for $1, his voice sounding louder than it should have. The gavel came down almost immediately. Sold. No one congratulated him. No one spoke to him at all. As the small crowd dispersed, Henry noticed the looks they gave him. It was not anger or jealousy. It was something closer to unease. Pity, maybe. As if he had just agreed to something he did not yet understand. By late afternoon, Henry stood at the edge of the property that had once belonged to his grandfather. The house sat exactly where it always had, facing the dirt road, slightly turned as if leaning away from town. The red paint on the porch had faded to a dull, chipped rust color, but it was unmistakable. The porch sagged in places, and weeds had pushed up through the gaps in the steps, yet the structure itself remained stubbornly intact. The surrounding land was quiet. No dogs barked, no neighbors came out to watch him unload his bag. Curtains shifted in distant windows, but doors stayed closed. Cypress Bend was aware of his return, and it did not welcome it. Henry unlocked the front door with the key provided by the county clerk and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and old wood, but not rot. The air was stale, not dead. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating furniture that had not been moved in years. A table near the wall, 2 chairs, his grandfather's house, frozen in a state somewhere between abandonment and waiting. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking through each room, reacquainting himself with the place. The walls were bare, but faint outlines hinted at where photographs and shelves had once hung. He felt an unexpected tightening in his chest, a mix of nostalgia and something sharper. This house had held his family's history, and somehow it had survived without them. As evening settled in, Henry sat on the porch steps and listened. Insects hummed in the tall grass. The sky burned orange and purple as the sun dipped low. It should have been peaceful. Instead, he felt exposed, as though the house and everything around it were being watched. When darkness fully arrived, the feeling did not fade. It intensified. That night, Henry lay on the narrow bed in the back room, staring at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly. Sometime after midnight, a sound pulled him awake, a dull, hollow knock, followed by another. It did not come from the walls or the door. It came from below, from beneath the house. Henry held his breath, listening. The sound did not repeat. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise itself. Morning light brought no answers, only questions. Henry stood beneath the porch, looking at the shadows under the house, his mind returning to the noise he had heard. He told himself it could have been an animal, a loose board, anything reasonable. But deep down, he knew the sound had been deliberate. As he brushed dirt from his hands and looked back at the red porch, a realization settled in. The house had not simply been forgotten. It had been left alone on purpose. And now that he was here, whatever had been waiting beneath it no longer was. Morning settled over Cypress Bend with a gray heaviness that clung to everything. The humidity pressed down on Henry's skin as he stood beneath the porch again, staring at the dark space under the house. In daylight, it looked smaller, less threatening, yet the memory of the sound from the night before refused to fade. He told himself he would take a careful look and then move on. Whatever had made the noise, he needed to know. He retrieved a flashlight from his car and crouched low, angling the beam beneath the porch. The light caught on dirt, roots, and the underside of old wooden boards. Nothing moved. Still, something felt wrong. The space looked too orderly, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully put back together. Henry reached out and pressed his hand against one of the boards supporting the porch. It did not shift, but the soil beneath it looked packed tighter than the surrounding ground. He moved slowly along the edge, examining every inch. Near the far corner, he noticed a line where the earth changed color, darker and more compact, forming a rough rectangle beneath the porch. It was subtle, the kind of detail easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Henry knelt and brushed away loose dirt with his fingers. The top edge of metal emerged beneath the soil, dull and rusted. His heart beat faster as he cleared more dirt away. What lay beneath was not scrap or debris, but a metal container, the kind once used by the military, its surface corroded, but intact. It had been deliberately buried and concealed, wedged beneath the porch beams and surrounded by packed earth. This was no accident. Someone had wanted it hidden, but close enough to retrieve. Henry sat back on his heels, the weight of the discovery settling in. The house had not simply been left standing. It had been used as a shield. He worked carefully, digging around the container until he could pull it free. The metal scraped softly against the soil as it came loose. It was heavier than he expected. He dragged it out into the light and wiped away dirt from the lid. The latch resisted at first, then gave with a dull click. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet yard. Inside, neatly stacked and wrapped in oilcloth, were papers. Dozens of them. Yellowed, brittle with age, but carefully preserved. Henry lifted the top bundle and unfolded the first document. It was a land deed, dated more than 70 years earlier, bearing the stamp of the county court. The names listed on it were unfamiliar, but the property description made his stomach tighten. It referenced land just beyond his grandfather's house, parcels he knew had been absorbed into town decades ago. He set the deed aside and reached for another document. Then another. Court orders, property transfers, letters addressed to local officials. Each page told a fragment of the same story, and with every new piece, the picture grew clearer and darker. Families had lost their land through rulings that made no sense. Properties had changed hands multiple times in impossibly short spans. Signatures repeated themselves with mechanical consistency, as if stamped rather than signed. Henry's hands trembled as he continued reading. These were not rumors or half-remembered grievances. They were records, proof, the kind that carried weight even after decades of dust and silence. A memory surfaced uninvited, his grandfather sitting at the kitchen table late at night, papers spread before him, carefully copied by hand. Elijah Brooks had always been cautious, always locking doors and lowering his voice when certain topics arose. As a child, Henry had once asked why he never spoke about the land beyond their fence. His grandfather had paused for a long moment before answering. Some things, he had said, were safer left alone until the right time. Henry had not understood then. He understood now. He closed the container and carried it inside, placing it on the table where sunlight spilled across the surface. One by one, he laid the documents out, sorting them carefully. The more he read, the more certain he became that his grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. These were not originals stolen from an office. Many were copies, annotated in the margins, cross-referenced with dates and names. Elijah Brooks had been building a record, preserving evidence in case the originals disappeared. And they had. Henry leaned back in the chair, the weight of the realization pressing on him. His grandfather had not simply lived quietly on the edge of town. He had been watching, documenting, and hiding proof of something that powerful people had wanted erased. The red porch was not a coincidence. It was a marker, a reminder to himself of where the truth was buried. The sound from the night before made sense now. The container had shifted, settling in the soil after years of silence. Or perhaps it had been disturbed by something else. Henry pushed the thought aside, but unease lingered. He carefully repacked the papers and locked the container again, sliding it beneath the table. As the afternoon wore on, he walked through the house with new eyes. This place had been more than a home. It had been a vault. Every creak of the floorboards, every quiet corner felt intentional. His grandfather had stayed here long after others had left, guarding something too dangerous to trust to anyone else. By evening, Henry knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been hidden under the porch was the reason the house had been left alone for so long. And now that he had uncovered it, the quiet that surrounded Cypress Bend felt less like neglect and more like restraint. The next morning, Henry locked the house before leaving, slipping the key into his pocket with a sense of unease he could not shake. The documents remained hidden beneath the table, out of sight, but very much present in his mind. What he had found under the porch had changed the way he saw the house, the town, and his own return. Cypress Bend was no longer just a place from his past. It was a place actively resisting its own history. His first stop was the town hall. The building stood at the center of Cypress Bend, a squat structure of brick and concrete that looked more functional than welcoming. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution. A woman sat behind the front desk, flipping through forms without looking up. When Henry stated his name and asked about historical land records connected to his grandfather's property, her fingers paused mid-page. She glanced at him, then down at the ledger beside her. Elijah Brooks, she repeated slowly, as if testing the name. That's an old file. I'd like to see it, Henry said. She hesitated, then shook her head. Those records aren't available for public review. Most of them were lost years ago." "Lost," Henry echoed. "All of them?" "That's what I said." Her tone hardened, and she slid the ledger closed. "You'll need a formal request, and even then, there's no guarantee anything still exists." Henry thanked her and stepped away, aware of the eyes following him as he crossed the room. He could feel it in the stiffness of their posture, in the way conversation stopped just long enough to acknowledge his presence. The town hall was not surprised by his questions. It was irritated by them. From there, he drove to the local bank. It was the same branch his grandfather had once used, though the sign out front bore a different name now. Inside, a young teller smiled politely as Henry approached. He explained that he needed to open an account connected to the property he had just purchased. She typed his information into the computer, nodding as she worked. Then her smile faded. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "There seems to be an issue." "What kind of issue?" "There's a restriction on that address. I'll need to speak with the manager." She disappeared into a back office. Henry waited, listening to the low hum of fluorescent lights. When the manager emerged, his expression was stiff and professional. "We won't be able to assist you," the man said. "At least not at this time." "Why not?" "Internal policy," the manager replied. "I suggest you try another branch." Henry left without arguing, though the refusal gnawed at him. Banks did not place restrictions on addresses without reason. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure that property remained unusable, invisible in ways that went far beyond neglect. By the time he returned to the house, the sun was high and the air thick with heat. He parked near the porch and immediately noticed the front door. The lock hung crooked, the wood around it splintered. Henry stepped out of the car slowly, his pulse quickening. He had locked the door. He was certain of it. Inside, nothing appeared stolen. The furniture remained untouched. The metal container was still beneath the table, exactly where he had left it. Yet the message was clear. Someone had entered the house without permission, not to take anything, but to remind him that he was not alone. That evening, as Henry sat at the table eating a simple meal, headlights swept across the front windows. A car slowed, then stopped outside. A knock followed, firm but controlled. Henry stood and opened the door to find a man in a pressed suit standing on the porch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "My name's Daniel Reeves," the man said. "I represent several local interests here in Cypress Bend." Henry did not invite him inside. "I heard you recently acquired this property," Reeves continued. "Thought it might be worth having a conversation." "About what?" "About options," Reeves said smoothly. "This house has been a burden for the town for a long time. We'd hate to see you take on unnecessary trouble." Henry folded his arms. "I'm not interested in selling." Reeves chuckled softly. "Everyone's interested in selling, Mr. Brooks. It's just a matter of price." He produced a folded document and held it out. "This is a very generous offer. Cash, no questions. You sign, you walk away, and you never have to worry about this place again." Henry glanced at the paper, but did not take it. "Why the sudden interest?" Reeves's smile thinned. "Let's just say the past can be complicated. Digging into it rarely brings anything good." "Is that a threat?" Reeves met his gaze calmly. "It's advice. Cypress Bend remembers its own, and it doesn't appreciate outsiders stirring things up, even ones who used to belong here." Henry felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, sharp and unexpected. "I belong here as much as anyone." Reeves studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Think about the offer. It won't stay on the table forever." He stepped back, turned, and walked down the porch steps without another word. That night, Henry sat alone in the house, the documents spread before him again. He reread them slowly, absorbing the names and dates, the pattern of theft and silence. He thought of his grandfather, of the life he had lived quietly, carrying a truth too heavy to share. Henry understood now that accepting the offer would mean erasing that sacrifice completely, yet the risks were becoming impossible to ignore. The town hall, the bank, the broken lock, the lawyer's visit. Cypress Bend was closing in, applying pressure in careful, calculated ways. Leaving would be easy. All he had to do was sign his name and disappear. Henry gathered the papers and placed them back into the container. He locked it and slid it beneath the table once more. Standing in the quiet room, he realized the decision had already been made. He had not come back to Cypress Bend to run. Whatever his grandfather had protected, Henry intended to see it through. Outside, the town settled into uneasy silence, as if holding its breath. Henry waited 2 days before making his next move, not out of fear, but out of necessity. He needed time to think, to understand exactly what he was holding and how far the consequences might reach. The town watched him closely during that time. Cars slowed as they passed the house. A man he did not recognize stood across the road one afternoon, pretending to fix a fence that did not need fixing. Cypress Bend had stopped pretending Henry's return was harmless. On the third morning, he drove out of town. The office of the civil rights organization was 2 hours away, located in a larger city where Cypress Bend's quiet pressure meant nothing. Henry had found the number through careful searching, avoiding local libraries and public computers. He carried only a small selection of documents with him, enough to prove his claims without risking everything at once. As he sat in the waiting room, surrounded by neutral walls and soft voices, he felt the first hint of something he had not felt since returning: safety. The attorney who met with him was a woman in her 40s, calm and precise. She listened without interrupting, as Henry explained what he had found and where it had been hidden. When he laid the documents on the table, her expression changed. She examined each page carefully, checking dates, seals, signatures. What began as professional curiosity turned into something more serious. "These are not rumors," she said quietly. "These are court-adjacent records. If they're authentic, they show systematic land theft." "They are authentic," Henry replied. "My grandfather copied them himself. He cross-checked everything." The organization moved quickly after that. Copies were made. Experts were consulted. Within days, the documents were verified against surviving state and federal archives. Missing files, long assumed destroyed in floods or fires, matched the copies Henry's grandfather had preserved. Names appeared again and again, forming a web of judges, clerks, and intermediaries who had quietly stripped families of their land. A federal prosecutor was brought in. The call came late one evening as Henry sat alone in the house, the porch light casting a dull glow across the red boards. The prosecutor's voice was steady, measured. He explained that the evidence pointed to a coordinated effort spanning decades, one that had relied on silence, intimidation, and the slow erosion of memory. The investigation would be formal. It would also be dangerous. "You should consider leaving town," the prosecutor said, "at least temporarily." Henry looked around the room, at the walls his grandfather had built his life within. "If I leave now," he said, "this place becomes quiet again. And quiet is how this survived." There was a pause on the line. "Then we'll take precautions." The shift in Cypress Bend was immediate once word began to spread. The town did not know details, but it sensed exposure. Whispers replaced open hostility. People who had avoided Henry now crossed the street to avoid him altogether. Others watched him with open resentment, as if he were personally responsible for something they had never wanted to acknowledge. Late one night, Henry found a note tucked beneath the front door. No name, no threat, just a single sentence, written in careful block letters. "Let the past stay buried." He burned the paper in the sink without responding. As the investigation expanded, Stories surfaced. Families came forward, hesitant at first, then more willing as the weight they had carried for generations began to lift. Elderly men and women spoke of grandparents forced off land, of hearings that lasted minutes, of judges who never looked up from their desks. The pattern was undeniable. Cypress Bend had been built on theft disguised as law. Henry learned more about his grandfather in those weeks than he had in his entire childhood. Elijah Brooks had attended hearings in secret. He had copied records late at night, knowing they would vanish by morning. He had stayed in that house not because he lacked options, but because leaving would have meant abandoning the truth entirely. When he died suddenly, 3 days after sealing the container beneath the porch, the town had exhaled in relief. Henry did not. The pressure increased as arrests were discussed openly. A local official resigned without explanation. Another moved out of state overnight. Daniel Reeves stopped returning calls. The bank quietly reversed its restrictions. Too late to matter. Cypress Bend was unraveling, thread by thread. One afternoon, as Henry stood on the porch watching storm clouds gather in the distance, he felt the weight of what he had started settle fully onto his shoulders. This was no longer about a house, or even about land. It was about a history that had been deliberately erased and the cost of restoring it. He knew the risks now. He understood why his grandfather had chosen silence for so long. But silence had only allowed the damage to spread. When the first subpoenas were issued, Henry received a call confirming what he already suspected. The investigation would go public. Names would be printed. The town would never be the same. As he ended the call, thunder rolled across the sky, low and distant. Henry stepped inside and closed the door, feeling neither triumph nor fear, only resolve. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The truth his grandfather had buried for safety had finally reached daylight, and Cypress Bend would have to face it. The investigation reached its conclusion quietly, without the spectacle Cypress Bend had always feared. There were no sirens cutting through the night, no dramatic arrests on courthouse steps. Justice arrived the way it often does when it is long overdue, methodical, documented, and impossible to ignore. Over the following months, federal rulings overturned decades of fraudulent decisions. Properties that had been taken under false pretenses were reassessed, boundaries redrawn, ownership restored where possible. Some families received land their grandparents had lost. Others received compensation when the land itself could no longer be returned. The names that had once carried unquestioned authority in Cypress Bend appeared in court filings and official reports, stripped of reverence and replaced with facts. The town reacted in stages. First came denial, then anger, then, slowly, acceptance. Cypress Bend could no longer pretend it was simply unlucky or forgotten. Its history had been examined and judged, not by rumor, but by record. The silence that had protected its secrets for generations finally broke. Henry watched it all from a distance, choosing not to insert himself into the public narrative. He testified when required and answered questions when asked, but he refused interviews and declined invitations to speak. The story was not about him. It never had been. It was about the truth his grandfather had protected alone for so long. When the final rulings were issued, Henry received a formal notice from the state acknowledging his role in preserving the evidence. Along with it came a modest financial settlement, compensation for the land and legal risks he had assumed. He deposited the money into a separate account and used only a portion of it. The rest he set aside for those who had lost more than he ever had. The house remained. Henry repaired it slowly, deliberately, replacing only what time had damaged beyond use. He reinforced the porch, sanded the boards, and repainted it the same deep red his grandfather had chosen decades earlier. Not brighter, not newer, the same color, a continuity rather than a replacement. Inside, the house changed as well. The old table was restored and returned to its place by the window. The walls were cleaned, not covered. The metal container was emptied, its contents transferred to official archives, where they would never again need to be hidden. When Henry sealed the space beneath the porch, he did so honestly, with plain wood and no secrets. Cypress Bend adjusted around him. Some people avoided the house entirely. Others, usually older residents, began to stop by in the evenings, sitting quietly on the porch steps, sharing stories they had never felt safe enough to tell before. Henry listened more than he spoke. He had learned that listening was often the most powerful thing a person could do. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas began their steady chorus, Henry sat alone on the red porch, watching shadows stretch across the yard. He thought about the letter that had brought him back, about the sound beneath the house that first night, about the weight his grandfather had carried without recognition or reward. The house no longer felt like a burden or a warning. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a place where truth endured, even when buried, a place that had waited patiently for the right moment and the right person to finish what had been started. Henry Brooks had returned to Cypress Bend, expecting to settle unfinished business. Instead, he had found purpose. Not in ownership or profit, but in restoration. The land around the house no longer felt stolen or silent. It felt honest. As night settled fully over the town, Henry rose from his chair and went inside, closing the door gently behind him. The red porch remained visible in the dim light, steady and unhidden. For the first time in a very long while, Cypress Bend had nothing left to conceal, and Henry knew, with a certainty that brought him peace, that some investments are not measured in money or land, but in the courage to face what others tried to erase. If you enjoyed the story, like the video and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from.